Welcome to America in Focus. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today, as usual, is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief. This week, President Joe Biden introduced his spending plan, his budget proposal that includes tax increases, but that he says will reduce the deficit over 10 years. Critics say that proposed tax increases will hurt the economy and that he doesn't do enough to reduce the deficit. Tell us, give us some more details here.
Yeah, this is interesting. As you said, Biden is claiming this will cut the deficit by $3 trillion, cut deficits by $3 trillion over the next 10 years. He focuses a lot on deficits because, of course, I think people know, but a deficit is basically the money added to the national credit card every year, right? The money we are in surplus, that we spend more than we make, that we, you could say live beyond our means. So that's kind of the debt we accrue each year, which is separate from the overall national debt, which is, nearing 32 trillion right now. So the overall, it's a little bit it can be a sleight of hand if people don't quite pay attention closely, because cutting deficits doesn't mean you're actually cutting the debt. The debt is still increasing even with these deficit cuts. Anyway, there are deficit cuts though. And of course, deficit cuts are better than deficit increases. And Biden's very proud of those. He's also touted a lot of the, line item things that pays for Social Security, Medicare, that kind of stuff. But as you said, there's some real tax increases. Now, Biden and his administration has said time and again that if you make less than $400,000, you won't be paying additional taxes. And he's been really proud of that. But some of these small business tax increases are definitely going to impact regular, Americans who are making, not wealthy Americans, I guess I'll say. And we can get into that more in a minute. But the other top line item is that Biden's budget also pours another $43 billion into the IRS, which we've been debating and talking a lot about on this podcast about how the $80 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act would be used in this army of auditors. So he's increasing it another $40 billion, which is another 50% of what the last increase was. So of course the IRS has its own issues and, recent history of being biased against certain groups. So there's a lot in here, as presidential budgets are as they go. It's kind of, they're mammoth, they're huge, they're kind of hard to read through the whole thing. And at the same time, they're really important. They set the agenda, but they also are not as consequential because presidential budgets never get accepted wholesale, right? This is more of a messaging. This is setting the priorities. It's very likely that some of these items will be included in Biden's agenda going forward. But Congress doesn't just say, okay, we're going to pass this. They create their own. They incorporate some of the president's things. And so any final budget would look a lot different. But, not that Congress really passes budgets anymore. They just do these deadline continuing resolutions nowadays.
Right. That's looming, right? In May, Congress will have to raise the debt limit or face defaulting on that debt. According to analysis of Biden's budget proposal from a Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonprofit group that looks at federal spending, the president's budget would borrow $19 trillion through 2033. As you mentioned up top, the federal debt is approaching $32 trillion. So in just 10 years, that could be more than $50 trillion.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's almost certainly going to happen. We're seeing the spending trajectory, unless the next administration comes along and does something drastic, that's where it's headed. And we wrote about this at thecentersquare.com, but the spending on the interest payments on the national debt is going to surpass spending on national defense, Dan. Just having the debt is going to be more expensive to us than all the tanks, everything, aircraft, all the soldiers' pay, all that combined. We're going to be spending more just to keep up with our debt than we spend on all of our national defense.
That can't be healthy, I wouldn't think. What's the breaking point when it comes to amassing such debt?
We don't know the breaking point. That's kind of what allows everyone to just keep going on. We don't know if the Titanic has struck the iceberg yet. Famously, after they struck the iceberg, they continued partying on, unaware that they were already sinking. And so we don't know if we've hit that iceberg, if we're starting to sink. And there's never really been a modern economy like ours that has so much global control, that is so large, that is able to withstand economic shocks. We have so many natural resources here in the U.S., even food resources as well, that we're able to could be self-sustaining in some kind of crisis. But we're in uncharted territory. I talked to experts about this, and nobody really knows. Our, debt surpassing GDP was kind of a red line when your debt is, but we're getting there, and it's like, okay, nothing is, we haven't sunk yet. So we're not going to know until it's too late, probably. And the thing is, the global economy is so interdependent and everyone else is in so much debt that it's just, we're in a weird global economic place. But you're right, it can't be good. And I think it's very fair to say it's not sustainable. We don't know when this whole thing is going to blow up, but you can't keep borrowing. I mean, we've known people who were in, just on anecdotal level, we've probably known people who are in a lot of debt. And when your interest payment is, more than your mortgage, then how can you live like that? Right.
Right. Would briefly just to tell us about what are the proposed tax increases? And
there's a lot, and we probably can't go into detail on all of them, but there's a billionaire's tax. There is raising the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. There's raising the top marginal income tax rate to 39.6%. Wow. So if you're in that top bracket, you'll be up to almost 40%. And then there's a lot of, there's small business taxes, and House Ways and Means. They put out kind of some bullets of these this morning, and they included a small business surtax that hits owner operated small businesses with a $650 billion tax hike. There's an additional $235 billion in taxes through an increase in the top individual tax rate for LLCs, as corporations and partnerships. There's 1 million small businesses that fit into that C corporation category that will face a tax rate that's much higher, which I kind of alluded to.
And of course, all these tax hikes that the president proposes for businesses, small and large, that's really a backdoor tax, critics would say, on consumers, because businesses, to make up for that, they're going to increase prices. They're going to lay off workers. They're going to reduce hours and benefits. Maybe they're going to pass those increased tax costs off on the rest of Americans. So that's, as I said, it's like a backdoor tax on everybody.
Right. I mean, it is. And there's also increased death tax. But, the thing about small businesses, they can be an anchor in a community. And so there's a very big gap between what you hear a lot of Democrats talk about in regards to, making billionaires pay their fair share versus the guy who owns a successful hardware store in a small town and technically, is considered a corporation because he's making enough money and he has maybe 20 employees or something, and they all have families. And so he's integral to the success of that community. And so when you hit someone like that, you're hitting a community, and it's not the same thing. It's just making billionaires pay their fair share.
Right. Of course, this is just the president's budget proposal. It still has to work its way through Congress, where Republicans have a slight majority in the House, Democrats have a slight majority in the Senate. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of back and forth before we get to a final budget. But Casey, thank you for your insight into this story. Listeners can keep up with Casey's reporting on the federal budget, on federal debt and deficits at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.